In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, a silent war is about to unfold. When Richard Mitchell walked out after 20 years of marriage for his 28-year-old secretary, he thought he was leaving behind a broken housewife. He couldn't have been more wrong. Eleanor Mitchell isn't just another abandoned wife. For 2 decades, she was the mastermind behind every successful business strategy he ever implemented. The silent partner who turned his failing ventures into gold. Now, armed with intimate knowledge of his business empire's weaknesses and a burning desire for justice, she's about to unleash a plan 2 decades in the making. This isn't just another revenge story. This is about how Manhattan's perfect power couple became the city's most ruthless business rivals, and how one woman turned betrayal into a billion-dollar empire. But here's what keeps Richard awake at night. How did Eleanor discover his biggest business secret, the one that could bring down everything he built? Before we dive deeper into this story of revenge and redemption, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's episode reveals the truth that changed everything. The September morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mitchell's Park Avenue penthouse, casting long shadows across the Italian marble countertops. Eleanor Mitchell moved with practiced grace through her gourmet kitchen, her silk robe whispering against her calves as she prepared Richard's breakfast, exactly the way he liked it. 2 eggs over medium, sourdough toast with Irish butter, and coffee from beans she special ordered from a small Costa Rican farm he'd once mentioned in passing. 20 years of marriage had taught her precision. The eggs needed exactly 3 minutes and 30 seconds to achieve that perfect balance between runny and firm that Richard preferred. The toast had to be golden brown but not too dark, and the coffee had to be served at precisely 165 degrees. She'd learned these particulars over years of careful observation, the same way she'd learned to read the subtle shifts in Richard's moods, to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. On the refrigerator, partially hidden behind a wedding anniversary card from last month, was a photograph from their recent trip to the Amalfi Coast. Eleanor paused, spatula in hand, studying it. Something about their smiles seemed different now, viewed through the lens of hindsight. Richard's didn't quite reach his eyes, and her own looked more hopeful than happy. But this morning, she pushed the observation aside, just as she'd been, pushing aside so many little warning signs. The sound of Richard's Italian leather shoes on the hardwood floors announced his arrival. Eleanor smoothed her hair, styled and highlighted to perfection at Bergdorf's just yesterday, and turned to greet him with a practiced smile. "Good morning, darling," she said, sliding the plate into place at his usual spot at the breakfast bar. "The Thompson merger documents are in your briefcase. I reviewed them last night and flagged the sections that needed attention." Richard's response was a distracted grunt as he settled onto the bar stool, his attention fixed on his phone. Eleanor noticed his suit, the new Tom Ford she'd helped him select, seemed slightly rumpled, as if he'd slept in it. Another detail she filed away without fully acknowledging its significance. "The Thompsons' lawyer called yesterday," she continued, pouring his coffee. "I made some notes about their concerns regarding the Asian market expansion. They're worried about the regulatory implications, but I think if you emphasize the 3rd quarter projections—" "I've got it handled, Eleanor," Richard cut her off, his tone carrying an edge she pretended not to hear. "You don't need to worry about the business details anymore." Eleanor's hand stilled momentarily as she set down the coffee pot. Any more? She'd been handling the business details since Richard's first venture, back when they were newlyweds and he was still trying to prove himself to his father. She'd spent countless nights poring over contracts, spotting the loopholes, identifying the opportunities others had missed. Her economics degree from Columbia might have gathered dust officially, but her mind had stayed sharp as a razor. "Course," she said smoothly, recovering. "I just thought—" "I said I've got it handled." Richard stood abruptly, leaving his breakfast barely touched. "I'll be late tonight. Board meeting." Eleanor watched him gather his things, noting how he avoided her eyes, how his movements seemed hurried and jerky, lacking their usual confident precision. She should have said something then. Should have asked about the late nights, the missed meals, the growing distance. Should have confronted the cologne that didn't belong to him, the credit card charges from jewelry stores when her birthday was months away. Instead, she said what she always said. "Have a wonderful day, darling. I'll have dinner waiting." The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed with finality. Eleanor stood in her perfect kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of her perfect life, and felt the first tremors of an earthquake she didn't yet know was coming. Later, she would remember this moment, this last perfect morning, as the calm before a storm that would reshape her entire world. She turned to clear Richard's plate, her reflection catching in the gleaming surface of the refrigerator. The woman staring back at her looked polished, poised, and utterly unprepared for what the afternoon would bring. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior lay something Eleanor herself had forgotten. Steel. The kind of steel that wouldn't just bend under pressure. It would forge itself into a weapon. Eleanor wasn't looking for evidence when she entered Richard's home office that afternoon. She was searching for the Morton contract, the one she'd helped negotiate last spring, because something about the Thompson merger's numbers didn't add up. 20 years of marriage had taught her to trust her instincts about business, even when Richard dismissed them. The leather chair creaked as she settled behind his massive mahogany desk. Everything in this room spoke of power. The floor to ceiling. Bookshelves filled with leather-bound first editions he never read. The contemporary art pieces she'd selected to impress clients. The vintage Mont Blanc pens arranged precisely on the desk blotter. A shrine to success, carefully curated. She began with the lateral file cabinet, her manicured fingers sliding through folders with practiced efficiency. M for Morton. But when she pulled the drawer wider, her hand brushed against something else. A folder labeled Personal Assets Cayman. Eleanor frowned. She managed their personal accounts. There shouldn't be anything she didn't know about. The folder was thick with documents, each page a revelation that turned her stomach a little more. Wire transfers to accounts she'd never seen. Property purchases under a shell corporation. And there, buried in the middle, hotel receipts. The Four Seasons, the Ritz, the Peninsula, all for dates when Richard had claimed to be at business conferences. Her hands didn't shake as she laid out the evidence of her husband's deception. The trained eye that had caught countless contractual loopholes now traced the pattern of betrayal, through bank statements and credit card bills. The gifts to Sarah Matthews, his secretary, began small. A lunch here, a pair of earrings there. Then larger purchases. A Cartier watch, a Chanel bag. The same brands Eleanor had once taught him to buy for her, but it was the business documents that truly caught her attention. Hidden beneath the proof of Richard's infidelity lay something potentially more damaging. Discrepancies in the company's international holdings. Transactions that didn't quite align with official records. Shadow accounts that suggested Richard had been moving money around in ways that skirted the edge of legality. Eleanor reached for her phone, then stopped. Who would she call? Their shared accountant? Their mutual friends? The carefully constructed network of their life together suddenly revealed itself as his network, not hers. She was an outsider looking in at a life she thought she knew. The afternoon light shifted, casting shadows across the desk. Eleanor methodically photographed each document with her phone, her mind already cataloging, analyzing, planning. The Eleanor of this morning might have confronted Richard immediately, might have demanded explanations through tears. But that? Eleanor was already fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She was replacing documents in the folder when she heard it, the distinctive sound of Richard's key in the front door. Hours too early for his return. Eleanor's heart thundered, but her hands remained steady as she returned everything to its precise position. She'd learned from Richard himself. In business, timing was everything. The voices drifting up from the foyer made her freeze. Richard's deep tone, followed by a feminine laugh. Young, carefree, the kind of laugh that belonged to someone who had never lost anything. Eleanor rose silently, her muscles coiled with a tension she'd never known before. She could confront them, now create a scene worthy of the society columns. Instead, she slipped out through the office's second door, the one that led to her private sitting room. Let them have their moment. She had something far more valuable: information. Back in her own space, Eleanor locked the door and sank into her favorite armchair. The sounds from below were muffled now. Giggles, murmurs, the creak of stairs. Her laptop hummed to life, and her fingers flew across the keys as she began to research. Offshore accounts, corporate law, SEC regulations. A text lit up her phone. Working late. Don't wait up. She looked at the message, then at the folders of evidence documented in her phone's camera roll. For the first time that afternoon, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Take your time, darling," she whispered to the empty room. "I'll be working late, too." Eleanor waited 3 days before she confronted him. 3 days of watching. Richard's practiced deceptions, of listening to his lies about late meetings while she traced his actual movements through credit card charges. 3 days of quietly copying documents, securing passwords, and making discreet calls to her personal attorney, not the family lawyer Richard had chosen. She chose a Sunday morning for the confrontation. Richard was most vulnerable on Sundays, when his guard was down and his phone wasn't buzzing with constant notifications. She'd prepared his favorite breakfast again, but this time it wasn't an act of devotion. It was strategy. "The coffee's perfect," Richard said, scanning the business section of the Times. "Did you change beans?" "No." Eleanor set down her own cup carefully. "Everything's exactly the same. Just like Sarah takes it now, I imagine. 3 sugars? Light cream?" The newspaper lowered slowly. Richard's face remained composed, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. His tell when he was caught off guard. Eleanor had noticed it during countless business negotiations. "Eleanor, don't." Her voice was soft but carried the sharp edge of a blade. "I've read the hotel receipts, Richard. I've seen the gifts, the transfers, the offshore accounts. All of it." Color drained from his face at the mention of the accounts. Interesting. He was more concerned about the financial discovery than the affair. She filed that reaction away for later. "Whatever you think you've found," he began. "What I think?" Eleanor's laugh held no warmth. "I've managed our finances for 20 years, Richard. I know the difference between creative accounting and fraud, just like I know the difference between a midlife crisis and systematic deception." Richard pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against Italian marble. "You're upset. I understand. But you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years." Eleanor remained seated, perfectly still. "Would you like me to elaborate on the discrepancies I found in the Asian market expansion documents? Or should we discuss the shell company you registered in the Caymans?" That stopped him. She watched his expression shift from defensive to calculating. This was the Richard she knew best, the businessman evaluating his position. "What do you want?" His voice was cold now, professional. "Want?" Eleanor took another sip of coffee. "I want you to leave. Today. I want you to walk out that door with whatever you can carry. Go to your little secretary and start planning your new life. Because this one? It's over. You're being dramatic." He straightened his collar. Another tell. "This is a simple divorce. We'll divide assets. You'll get a generous settlement." "Simple?" She finally stood, unfolding like a steel blade. "No, Richard. Simple was what you could have had if you'd been honest. Simple was what you could have had if you'd stuck to betraying. Just me, and not the shareholders." His face went still. "Be careful, Eleanor." "Or what?" She moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You'll destroy me? You can't. Everything I've found is already documented, distributed, and secured. If anything happens to me, if you try to steamroll me in the divorce, if you so much as breathe wrong in my direction, it all comes out. You're bluffing. Try me." She smiled. And for the first time, Richard took a step back. "You taught me well, darling. Always have leverage. Always secure your position. Always be willing to go nuclear." The silence stretched between them, 20 years of partnership collapsing into this single moment. Finally, Richard moved toward the door, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. "You'll regret this," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "No." Eleanor's voice was almost gentle. I won't. After he left, Eleanor walked through their home, her home now, noting what he'd taken. His passport from the study, the spare Rolex from the bedroom safe, the photo of his parents from his nightstand. On her pristine kitchen counter, he'd left a hastily scrawled note. My lawyers will contact yours. She picked up the note, ran her fingers over the angry indent of his words. Then she walked to her office, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and began to write. Not tears, not recriminations, not the screams that burned in her throat. No, she wrote numbers, plans, the framework of an empire that would rise from the ashes of her marriage. Richard thought he was walking away from a broken woman. Instead, he was walking into a war he didn't even know he was about to fight. The first 24 hours after Richard's departure passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor moved through her home like a general surveying a battlefield, her laptop balanced on one arm as she documented everything. The art collection she'd curated, the wine cellar she'd stocked, the safe room Richard thought she didn't know about, hidden behind his pretentious library of first editions. Her personal attorney, Patricia Chen, arrived at precisely 9 a.m. the next morning. Eleanor had chosen her years ago, quietly keeping her on retainer, a contingency plan she'd never admitted to herself she was making. Coffee? Eleanor offered, leading Patricia to her private study rather than Richard's more imposing office. You're remarkably composed, Patricia observed, accepting the cup. Most clients in your situation aren't quite so organized. Eleanor smiled thinly, opening her laptop to reveal a meticulously structured spreadsheet. Most clients in my situation spent 20 years playing hostess while their husbands built empires. I spent 20 years taking notes. For the next 3 hours, they methodically cataloged Eleanor's position. Assets, properties, bank accounts. More importantly, they mapped out what Eleanor knew about Richard's business operations. Every weakness, every questionable deal, every potential pressure point. The Asian expansion is his weak spot, Eleanor explained, pulling up another document. Richard's been cutting corners on regulatory compliance. He thinks the Chinese officials are bought and paid for, but he's missing the bigger picture. The new administration is cracking down on exactly the kind of arrangements he's made. Patricia's eyebrows rose. You seem to know more about his business than most CEOs know about their own companies. I listened, Eleanor said simply. For 20 years I listened, to his phone calls, his late-night worries, his drunken boasts at dinner parties. Richard thought I was just being supportive. He never realized I was learning. They broke for lunch, which Eleanor had catered from Daniel, Richard's favorite restaurant. A small act of defiance, charging it to the account he hadn't yet thought to cancel. There's something else, Eleanor said as they picked at their plates. The Thompson merger. It's not what everyone thinks. She pulled out a handwritten notebook, her merger analysis that Richard had dismissed just days ago. Page after page of careful observations, market trends, and potential complications that Richard had overlooked in his rush to close the deal. Thus, Asian market complications aren't just about regulations, she explained. There's a cultural dimension he's completely missed. The Thompson family's reputation in the region, their history with local businesses. Richard's charging ahead without understanding the nuances. It's going to blow up in his face. Patricia studied the notes, her expression thoughtful. This is extremely detailed analysis. Have you considered starting my own company? Eleanor finished. Since approximately 2 hours after I found the hotel receipts. She opened another file on her laptop, a business plan she'd begun drafting the night before. Not just a plan for survival, but for dominance. Every section was crafted to exploit the weaknesses she'd discovered in Richard's empire. He's vulnerable, Eleanor continued. Not just because of the questionable accounts or the regulatory issues. He's vulnerable because he thinks he's invincible, because he never imagined I could be a threat. Patricia closed the notebook carefully. Eleanor, what exactly are you planning? I'm planning to take everything. Eleanor's voice was calm, matter of fact. Not through the courts, not through scandal, through pure, ruthless business strategy. Richard taught me that perception is reality in our world. Right now, everyone perceives me as the wronged wife, the victim, the afterthought. She stood, walking to the window that overlooked the Manhattan skyline. I'm going to show them something different. I'm going to build something he can't touch, can't control, can't destroy, and I'm going to use everything he taught me against him. The courts won't look kindly on obvious retaliation, Patricia warned. This isn't about retaliation. Eleanor turned back, her expression sharp. This is about creating something of my own. Something I should have built years ago instead of propping up his dreams. Richard's not my target. He's my case study. I know exactly how he thinks, how he moves, how he fails. I'm not going to destroy him. I'm going to outmaneuver him. And I'm going to do it so legally, so precisely, that he'll never be able to touch me. For the first time that day, Patricia smiled. Now that, she said, sounds like a plan worth executing. They worked until evening, mapping out the first phases of Eleanor's strategy. As Patricia gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door. You know he'll fight back, she said quietly. Eleanor nodded, her hand already reaching for her laptop. I'm counting on it. Richard's most dangerous when he's angry. When he's angry, he makes mistakes, and I'll be watching for every single one. After Patricia left, Eleanor sat alone in her study, surrounded by the blueprint of her future. On her desk, she placed a single sheet of paper and began to write, her elegant handwriting filling the page with a list of names. Former employees Richard had discarded, clients he'd taken for granted, partners he'd undervalued. At the top of the page, she wrote a single phrase, foundation stones. These would be the building blocks of her empire. People who knew Richard's weaknesses firsthand, who had reason to want something different, something better. People who, like her, had been underestimated. Tomorrow, she would begin making calls. But tonight, she allowed herself one small moment of victory. She opened the precious bottle of Bordeaux that Richard had been saving for his next big merger celebration, poured herself a glass, and raised it to her reflection in the window. To new beginnings, she whispered, and to the art of patient revenge. David Chen's corner office at Mitchell Industries had a perfect view of Central Park, but he barely noticed it anymore. After 15 years as chief financial officer, the view had become just another corporate perk, like the car service and premium health insurance that kept him tethered to a job he'd grown to resent. The knock on his door was so soft he almost missed it. Come in, he called, not looking up from the quarterly reports he was reviewing. Reports that were making his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Hello, David? He knew that voice. His head snapped up to find Eleanor Mitchell standing in his doorway, immaculately dressed in a charcoal Chanel suit he'd never seen before. Mrs. Mitchell, Eleanor, he stammered, rising quickly. I wasn't expecting. No one expects me these days, she said, closing the door behind her. That's rather the point, isn't it? She moved to sit in one of his visitor chairs, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. David remained standing, his mind racing. Everyone knew about the separation. It was all anyone at headquarters could talk about. But no one expected Eleanor to show up here, in the heart of Richard's territory. I assume, Eleanor continued, that Richard has everyone working overtime on the Thompson merger? David's silence was answer enough. And I assume, she went on, opening her briefcase, that you've noticed the same problems with the Asian market. Projections that I flagged 3 weeks ago? David felt the blood drain from his face. He'd raised those exact concerns in yesterday's board meeting, only to have Richard dismiss them as unnecessary pessimism. Eleanor placed a folder on his desk. I'm starting a new venture, David, and I need a CFO who understands the importance of actual due diligence, not just rubber stamping the CEO's vision. I can't, David began, but his eyes were already drawn to the folder. Can't? Eleanor's smile was knowing. Or won't? How long have you been covering for Richard's creative accounting, David? How many times have you had to revise reports to match his projections rather than reality? He sank back into his chair. How did you know? Because I know Richard. And I know you're too good at your job to have missed the discrepancies I found. She leaned forward. I'm offering you a chance to do things the right way. Clean books, ethical practices, and a 20% bump in salary with full autonomy over financial operations. David's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the folder. Inside was a complete business plan, along with an employment contract. That made his current salary look almost insulting. He'll sue, David said, but his tone lacked conviction. The non-compete clause is unenforceable given the circumstances, Eleanor finished. Patricia Chen already has the paperwork prepared, and Richard won't sue. Not when a lawsuit would require opening his books to outside scrutiny. She stood, smoothing her skirt. You have 24 hours to decide, David. But ask yourself this. Do you want to be CFO of a company built on solid ground, or do you want to be the one holding the bag when Richard's house of cards finally collapses? Eleanor left him with the folder and his thoughts, but she didn't go far. Her next stop was 2 floors down, to the office of Maria Herrera, head of international relations, who Richard had recently passed over for promotion in favor of a less qualified male colleague. By day's end, Eleanor had made 5 such visits. Each time she left behind a folder, a promise, and a 24-hour deadline. Each conversation was different, tailored to what she knew about their frustrations, their ambitions, their fears. When she finally returned home, Eleanor found 3 messages waiting. David, Maria, and Thomas from legal had all said yes. Within an hour, the other 2 had followed suit. She poured herself a glass of wine and opened her laptop, pulling up the incorporation papers Patricia had prepared. At the top was the company, name she'd chosen, Phoenix Capital Partners. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Heard you were in the building today. Stay away from my company. Eleanor smiled, typing her response. Your company? How interesting. I distinctly remember all those nights I helped you build it, all those strategies I suggested, all those relationships I nurtured. Perhaps we need to revisit the definition of yours. She sent the text, then turned off her phone. Let him stew overnight, imagining what she might be planning. Tomorrow would be soon enough to show him exactly what she was capable of building from the ashes of the life he'd burned down. Eleanor signed the incorporation papers with a flourish, then opened a new document to begin drafting her first press release. The headline would shake Richard's world. Eleanor Mitchell launches Phoenix Capital Partners with industry veterans at the helm. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, she had one more call to make. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd saved years ago, just in case. James? It's Eleanor Mitchell. Remember that conversation we had at the charity gala last year? About how Richard was mishandling your family's investment portfolio? I think it's time we had a proper discussion about better options. The press release hit the financial news outlets at precisely 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. Eleanor watched from her newly leased offices in the MetLife building as the story spread across Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal. The timing wasn't accidental. She'd chosen the exact moment Richard always held his weekly executive meeting. Phoenix Capital Partners launches with Industry Dream Team, the headlines declared. Below were the professional biographies of her new executive staff, each one a former Mitchell Industries star player. The message was clear to anyone who understood corporate warfare. This wasn't just a new company, it was a declaration of intent. Your ex-husband's on line 1, her new assistant announced. Eleanor had hired Jessica specifically for her unflappable demeanor and her previous experience handling crisis communications for a Fortune 500 company. Not now, Eleanor replied, her eyes on the real prize. James Rothschild, heir to one of Mitchell Industries' largest investment portfolios, was due to arrive in 10 minutes. The conference room Eleanor had chosen for the meeting offered a direct view of Richard's office tower. Another calculated decision. Every detail of Phoenix's offices had been designed to project both success and accessibility, the opposite of Mitchell Industries' intimidating corporate fortress. James arrived exactly on time, his family's trademark punctuality evident. Quite an announcement this morning, Eleanor, he said, accepting the offered coffee. Richard must be apoplectic. Richard's emotional state isn't my concern, Eleanor replied smoothly. Your family's investment returns, however, are very much my priority. She opened a presentation that David Chen had prepared. The numbers were devastating in their clarity. 5 years of underperformance in the Rothschild portfolio under Mitchell, industries management hidden beneath layers of complex financial instruments. Your family's wealth deserves better than creative accounting and misdirection, Eleanor said, turning to a new slide. At Phoenix, we're proposing complete transparency, quarterly independent audits, and an investment strategy that prioritizes sustainable growth over quick profits. James studied the projections carefully. Eleanor waited, knowing that patience was crucial. The Rothschilds hadn't maintained their fortune for generations by making hasty decisions. These returns are conservative, he noted. They're realistic, Eleanor corrected, something Richard never quite mastered. We're not promising miracles, James. We're promising honesty, diligence, and results you can trust. 3 hours later, James left with a preliminary agreement in his briefcase. Eleanor watched from her window as his town car pulled away, allowing herself a small smile. The Rothschild account wasn't just any client. It was a signal to the entire financial community. Where the Rothschilds went, others would follow. Her phone buzzed again. Richard, again. This time, she picked up. Have. You lost your mind? He demanded, skipping any pretense of civility. Good morning, Richard. I trust you saw the news? You poached my CFO, my head of international relations, my top legal counsel, your former employees, Eleanor corrected, all of whom were free to seek new opportunities, just like I was free to provide them. This is war, Richard growled. No, darling, this is business. I learned from the best, remember? All those nights you spent explaining corporate strategy to your supportive wife? Her voice hardened. I was paying attention. She could hear him, struggling to control his breathing. The Rothschilds will never— James just left my office, she cut in. Lovely man. So concerned about those irregularities in his family's portfolio that you've been hiding. You really should have been more careful with those quarterly reports. The silence on the other end was deafening. Welcome to the new reality, Richard. Eleanor continued. I'm not your wife anymore. I'm your competitor. And unlike you, I don't underestimate my opponents. She ended the call and turned back to her view of the city. Below, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy, unaware that a seismic shift had just occurred in its financial landscape. Her phone lit up with notifications as news of the Rothschild account began to circulate. Before the day was over, 3 more major clients had requested meetings. Eleanor smiled as Jessica added them to her calendar. Richard had taught her well. In business, perception was reality. And right now, the perception was that Eleanor Mitchell wasn't just surviving, she was winning. Jessica, she called, get me Maria Herrera. It's time to begin our Asian market strategy, and send in the Bloomberg reporter who's been waiting. In reception. Let's make sure tomorrow's headlines are just as interesting as today's. 3 months after Phoenix Capital's launch, Eleanor sat in her office reviewing the latest market analysis. The numbers told a story that even she hadn't dared hope for. 15 major clients transferred from Mitchell Industries, a 30% increase in managed assets, and a growing reputation for ethical business practices that was attracting attention from sustainable investment funds. The Financial Times piece just went live, Jessica announced, placing a tablet on Eleanor's desk. The headline read, Phoenix Rising, How Eleanor Mitchell is Redefining Wall Street's Old Boys Club. Send copies to our potential investors, Eleanor instructed, but her attention was already shifting to the email that had just appeared in her inbox. The subject line read, Urgent, Thompson Merger Complications. She opened it to find a confidential report from her sources inside Mitchell Industries. The Asian market complications she'd predicted were finally materializing. Richard's rushed approach to regulatory compliance was backfiring spectacularly, and the Thompson family was getting nervous. Get me Andrew Thompson on the phone, Eleanor said to Jessica, and clear my afternoon. While waiting for the call, Eleanor reviewed her notes from all those dinner parties where Richard had dismissed the Thompson family's concerns. She'd listened when they spoke about their legacy, their commitment to ethical business practices, their fear of losing face in Asian markets. Richard had heard complaints to be managed. Eleanor had heard opportunities to be seized. Andrew Thompson. "On line 1, Jessica announced. "Andrew," Eleanor greeted warmly. "I was just thinking about that conversation we had at the Metropolitan Opera Gala last year, about your family's concerns regarding Asian market penetration." There was a pause on the other end. "You warned us, didn't you? About the regulatory issues?" "I tried to." Eleanor kept her tone carefully neutral. "Richard has his own way of doing things." "Had," Andrew corrected. "The board is meeting tomorrow." "The merger? It's not going well?" Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "I might have a solution, if you're interested in hearing it." 2 hours later, Andrew Thompson left her office with a new proposal in his briefcase. Not a hostile takeover. Not a competitive bid, but a partnership. Phoenix would handle the Asian market transition, using Maria Herrera's extensive connections and cultural understanding to smooth the regulatory waters. The Thompson family would retain control of their core business while gaining access to Phoenix's ethical investment framework. "Make sure legal has the partnership agreement ready by morning," Eleanor told Jessica. "And get me Maria. We need to move quickly on the Asian compliance issues." Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "What the hell did you say to Andrew Thompson?" Eleanor ignored it, focusing instead on the stream of emails flowing in. News of the Thompson partnership was already spreading through private channels. By morning, Mitchell Industries' stock would take a hit, and Phoenix's reputation would soar higher. But it wasn't enough. Eleanor pulled up the dossier she'd been building on Richard's other vulnerabilities. The Thompson deal was just the beginning. She'd learned from Richard that true business success wasn't about winning single battles. It was about positioning yourself to win the war. "Ms. Mitchell?" Jessica appeared in the doorway. "The Goldman Sachs representatives are here for the partnership discussion." Eleanor stood, smoothing her silk blouse. "Show them in. And Jessica? Send a bottle of champagne to Andrew Thompson's office. The same vintage we served at his daughter's wedding. Include a note. To new beginnings and stronger partnerships. A Z?" She walked into the conference room. Eleanor caught her reflection in the glass walls. Gone was the polished but passive corporate wife. In her place stood someone new, a woman who had learned to turn vulnerability into strength, betrayal into opportunity, and rage into calculated success. The Goldman Sachs team rose as she entered. Eleanor noted their expressions, curiosity mixed, with respect. 3 months ago, they would have dismissed her as Richard's ex-wife. Now they saw her as something far more interesting, a threat to the old guard and an opportunity they couldn't ignore. "Gentlemen," she began, "let's talk about the future of ethical investment banking." The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, embossed with gold lettering. "Together with their families, Richard Mitchell and Sarah Matthews request the pleasure of your company." Eleanor held it for a long moment, studying the formal script that announced her replacement's triumph. 6 months had passed since Richard's departure, and now here was the final nail in the coffin of her old life. "Shall I RSVP with our regrets?" Jessica asked, hovering in the doorway of Eleanor's office. "No," Eleanor replied, setting the invitation aside. "Send our congratulations and have the usual arrangement delivered to the church, white roses and lilies. Sign the card, warmest wishes on your special day, Eleanor Mitchell." Jessica's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded and withdrew. Eleanor turned to her window, watching the autumn light play across the Manhattan skyline. The invitation wasn't a surprise. She'd known about the wedding plans for weeks, thanks to her carefully maintained social network. What surprised her was how little it hurt. Her intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Astor is here for lunch." Barbara Astor had been Eleanor's closest friend during her marriage, the one person she'd thought would stand by her through anything. But as Eleanor rose to greet her, she noted the slight hesitation in Barbara's embrace, the careful way she avoided Eleanor's eyes. "The plaza isn't the same without your charity galas," Barbara said as they settled into their usual corner table at Le Bernardin. The new chairwoman. Well, she's trying, but she's not me, Eleanor finished. It's fine, Barbara. I've found other ways to make a difference. Yes, I've heard. Barbara fiddled with her water glass. Richard says, is that why you're here? Eleanor cut in gently. To report back to Richard? The flush that spread across Barbara's cheeks was answer enough. Eleanor sat back, studying the woman she'd once trusted with her deepest confidences. The social machinery of their world was intricate and merciless. She'd known this reckoning was coming. He's worried, Barbara continued, almost apologetically. The Thompson deal, the Goldman partnership. He says you're trying to destroy everything he built? Everything we built, Eleanor corrected. And I'm not destroying anything, Barbara. I'm creating something new, something better. But at what cost? Barbara leaned forward. The holiday party circuit, the charity boards, the summer gatherings in the Hamptons. You're missing from all of it. People are talking. Let them talk. Eleanor smiled, but there was steel beneath it. I spent 20 years planning other people's parties and managing other people's charitable impulses. Now I'm building something of my own. It's not too late, Barbara said softly. If you'd just apologize, try to mend fences. Apologize? Eleanor's laugh drew glances from nearby tables. For what? For refusing to fade quietly into obscurity? For daring to succeed without a man's permission? She opened her clutch and withdrew her platinum card. Not the joint account Richard had finally thought to cancel, but her own, backed by Phoenix's success. Lunch is on me, she said, rising. Give my best to Richard. And Barbara, next time he wants information about my business, tell him to check the financial papers like everyone else. Back in her office, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of grief, not for Richard's remarriage, but for the friendships that had proven as false as her marriage. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister in Connecticut. Saw the wedding invitation. You okay? Eleanor smiled. Not all relationships had crumbled. Her sister had stood by her, along with a handful of true friends who'd admired her resilience rather than fearing it. Even her former housekeeper, Maria, still sent her weekly updates about the neighborhood gossip. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. David Chen entered, carrying a thick folder. The latest analysis of Mitchell Industries' market position, he said. Their stock dropped another 3 points after the Thompson announcement. Eleanor nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. David, what made you say yes when I offered you the CFO position here? He considered for a moment. Because you saw me, he said finally. Not just my skills or my usefulness, but me. Richard. He never really saw any of us. We were just pieces on his chessboard. And now we're building something real. He smiled. Something that matters. After David left, Eleanor picked up the wedding invitation again. With careful precision, she tore it into tiny pieces and let them flutter into her wastepaper basket. Then she opened her laptop and began reviewing the latest acquisition proposals. Let Richard have his society wedding. She had an empire to build. And unlike the social circles that had once defined her world, this empire would be built on something far stronger than appearances. It would be built on truth, competence, and the loyalty of people who had chosen to follow her vision, not her husband's name. The intercom buzzed again. Your 4 o'clock is here. The Sustainable Energy Fund representatives. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and stood. Another meeting, another opportunity, another step. Forward. The personal cost of her transformation was high, but the rewards were just beginning to unfold. The quarterly earnings call for Mitchell Industries was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. Eleanor sat in her office, phone on mute, listening as Richard attempted to explain away their worst quarter in 5 years. His voice, once so confident, now held an edge of desperation that only those who knew him well would recognize. While we've faced some temporary setbacks in the Asian market, our core business remains strong, Richard was saying. The Thompson situation was unfortunate, but we're exploring new partnerships that will— Mr. Mitchell, a Deutsche Bank analyst interrupted. Can you address the exodus of institutional investors to Phoenix Capital Partners? Specifically, their ethical investment framework that seems to be attracting your former client base? Eleanor smiled as Richard cleared his throat. She'd timed Phoenix's latest innovation perfectly, announcing their proprietary ESG, environmental, social, and governance, scoring system just days before Mitchell Industries' earnings call. Phoenix Capital, Richard's voice hardened at the name, is operating on a limited scale. Their so-called ethical framework is nothing more than clever marketing. Our track record speaks for itself. A track record that shows 3 consecutive quarters of decline, another analyst pointed out. Meanwhile, Phoenix Capital reports 40% growth in managed assets. Eleanor's intercom buzzed. Ms. Mitchell? The Singapore regulators are online too regarding the Asian market expansion. She muted the earnings call. This was the moment she'd been building toward. While Richard was busy defending his past, she was securing Phoenix's future. Maria Herrera had spent weeks in Singapore, laying the groundwork for what would become their Asia-Pacific headquarters. "Good evening, Mr. Chang," she greeted the regulatory chief. "I trust you've reviewed our compliance proposal?" The conversation was brief but productive. Within 20 minutes, Phoenix had preliminary approval for their Asian operations, something that had eluded Mitchell Industries for months. When she returned to the earnings call, Richard was struggling to explain their latest setback. The stock was already down 7% in pre-market trading. "Jessica," Eleanor called, "release the Singapore announcement." Within minutes, financial news tickers began reporting Phoenix's Asian market breakthrough. She watched as Mitchell Industries' stock dropped another 3 points. On the earnings call, Richard abruptly ended the Q&A session. Her phone lit up with a text from him. "You planned this." "No, Richard," she typed back. "I prepared for it. There's a difference." Eleanor spent the rest of the morning in strategy meetings, reviewing expansion plans with her executive team. The contrast between these sessions and the ones she'd observed at Mitchell Industries was stark. Here, diverse voices were heard, innovative ideas were welcomed, and decisions were made based on data rather than ego. The Mitchell Industries situation, David Chen reported, is worse than they're admitting. Their Asian market losses are just the beginning. The Thompson deal fallout has made other family-owned businesses nervous. They're hemorrhaging traditional clients. And we're positioned to catch them, Eleanor nodded. But we need to be selective. We're not just taking Richard's clients. We're building something different. Maria Herrera spoke up next. Our reputation in Asia is growing. The way we handled the Thompson transition showed respect for local business customs. It's opening doors. Speaking of doors, Eleanor turned to her chief of operations. How are we progressing with the talent acquisition? 3 more Mitchell executives reached out this week, he reported. Mid-level managers who've seen the writing on the wall. Eleanor considered this. The collapse she'd predicted was happening faster than expected. Richard's inability to adapt, his stubborn adherence to old methods, was accelerating his decline. After the meeting, she took a moment to review the latest market analysis. Phoenix wasn't just growing, it was reshaping the industry. Their ethical investment framework had caught the attention of a new generation of investors, ones who wanted their money to drive positive change. A notification popped up on her screen. Mitchell Industries had canceled their annual investor conference. The company that had once dominated Wall Street's social calendar couldn't risk the public scrutiny. "Jessica," Eleanor called, "schedule a press conference for next week. It's time to announce Phase 2. Phase 2 was her masterstroke. A complete reimagining of investment banking for the modern era. While Richard clung to his crumbling empire, she was building the future. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Sarah, Richard's new wife. "He's drinking during the day now, taking it out on everyone. What did you do to him?" Eleanor stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "I didn't do anything to him, Sarah. He did this to himself, just like he'll eventually do to you." She put down her phone and turned back to her work. The market forces she'd set in motion were just beginning to show their full power. Richard had taught her well. In business, timing was everything. And her time was now. The Parker Meridian's executive conference room hadn't changed since the last charity gala Eleanor had organized there. Same crystal chandeliers, same mahogany table, same air of old money privilege. But everything else had changed, including Eleanor herself, as she took her seat across from Richard at the emergency shareholders meeting. This was their first face-to-face encounter since his wedding 3 months ago. Eleanor noted the new lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie. The mighty Richard Mitchell, brought low by the very forces he'd once wielded so confidently. "Let's begin," the shareholders' representative announced. "We're here to discuss Mitchell Industries' response to the current market challenges and the proposed restructuring plan." Eleanor kept her expression neutral as Richard stood to present. She didn't need to take notes. David had already provided her with a complete analysis of Mitchell Industries' desperate strategy. "Our temporary setbacks have been greatly exaggerated," Richard began, his voice carrying a forced confidence she knew too well. "The Asian market situation is stabilizing, and our new partnerships—" "Excuse me," Eleanor interrupted softly. Every head turned toward her. "Before we proceed, I believe the shareholders should be aware that Phoenix Capital has acquired an additional 12% of Mitchell Industries stock on the open market. Combined with our existing holdings, that makes us the largest minority shareholder." The room erupted in whispers. Richard's face went pale, then red. "That's impossible. The trading regulations were followed to the letter," Eleanor finished. "We filed all the necessary disclosures. Check your inbox, Richard. The notifications went out this morning." She opened her portfolio, extracting a single sheet of paper. "Now, about those temporary setbacks. Would you like to explain the undisclosed losses in the Singapore operation, or shall I?" Richard's new wife, Sarah, attending as his executive assistant, touched his arm in warning. But Richard was already falling into Eleanor's trap, his temper rising exactly as she'd predicted. "You think you can walk in here and dictate terms?" he snarled. "This is my company!" "Our company now," Eleanor corrected calmly. "And the shareholders deserve to know the truth about its condition." "David?" David Chen rose from his seat near the door, distributing detailed reports to each board member. "The actual losses in Asia exceed reported figures by approximately $340 million. The Thompson deal collapse triggered a cascade of client departures that management has deliberately obscured through creative accounting." Eleanor watched as the board members flipped through the documentation, their expressions growing increasingly grave. She'd chosen this moment carefully, knowing that Richard's emotional state would prevent him from mounting an effective defense. "This is a hostile takeover," Richard declared, desperation edging into his voice. "No," Eleanor replied. "This is accountability. Phoenix Capital is prepared to offer a partnership that would stabilize Mitchell Industries' position and protect shareholder value. We're not here to destroy Richard's legacy. We're here to save it from his own worst impulses." She nodded to Jessica, who began distributing another set of documents. "Our proposal includes a complete restructuring plan, ethical compliance framework, and strategic roadmap for sustainable growth. We're offering Mitchell Industries shareholders a choice between continued decline and profitable reform." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is because of the divorce, isn't it? Some kind of twisted revenge." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "This is business, Richard. You taught me that emotions have no place in the boardroom. Remember?" The shareholders' representative cleared his throat. "Given these revelations, I move to suspend normal proceedings and convene an emergency board session to review Phoenix Capital's proposal." "Seconded," came a voice from the end of the table. Eleanor recognized Arnold Whitman, one of Richard's oldest allies on the board. The betrayal hit Richard visibly. "This meeting is adjourned for 1 hour," the representative announced. "Mr. Mitchell, I suggest you and your team review these documents carefully." As the room cleared, Eleanor remained seated, watching Richard's world crumble around him. He stood frozen, staring at her with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "How?" he finally managed. "How did you do this?" Eleanor stood, gathering her things. "I learned from the best, Richard. You just never imagined I was paying attention." She paused at the door. Oh, and Richard? This is only the beginning. You have 1 hour to decide. Partnership or proxy? War. Choose wisely. She left him there, surrounded by the evidence of his failures. In the elevator, Jessica handed her a phone. Maria's team in Singapore is standing by, and the PR statement is ready to go, whichever way he decides. Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't victory, not yet, but it was vindication. Not because she'd hurt Richard, but because she'd outmaneuvered him at his own game, using every lesson he'd unknowingly taught her. Tell Maria to be ready, she instructed. Either way, tomorrow morning the financial world is going to look very different. The headlines dominated the financial press for weeks. Mitchell Industries announces historic partnership with Phoenix. Capital. Eleanor Mitchell, the new queen of Wall Street. How a corporate wife became a business revolution. But Eleanor barely had time to read them. She was too busy building. The integration teams worked around the clock, merging Mitchell Industries' traditional infrastructure with Phoenix's innovative approaches. Eleanor moved between conference rooms like a general commanding multiple fronts, ensuring that each transition followed her exact vision. The London office is fully operational, Maria reported during their morning briefing. The European regulatory authorities have fast-tracked our compliance certifications. They're particularly impressed with our ethical investment framework. And Mitchell Industries' old guard? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Most are adapting well to the new structure. The ones who aren't, Maria shrugged. They're finding opportunities elsewhere. Eleanor nodded, scanning the latest numbers on her tablet. The market had responded to the partnership announcement exactly as she'd predicted. Mitchell Industries' stock had stabilized, then begun to climb as investors recognized the potential of the combined entities. Phoenix's reputation for ethical practices had given the old firm a much-needed credibility boost. What about Richard? She asked quietly. Relegated to a ceremonial advisory role, as agreed. He's barely been in the office. Word is, he's shopping for property in Palm Beach. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Richard had chosen partnership over proxy war, but they both knew it was really a surrender dressed up as a merger. His golden parachute would ensure a comfortable retirement, far from the empire he'd lost. Her intercom buzzed. Ms. Mitchell, the Goldman Sachs team is here for the global expansion meeting. The next 4 hours were a blur of presentations, negotiations, and strategic planning. Eleanor's vision went far beyond absorbing Mitchell Industries. She was restructuring the very nature of investment banking, creating a model that balanced profit with responsibility. Your proposed expansion into emerging markets, the Goldman executive noted. It's ambitious. It's necessary, Eleanor corrected. The old model of exploitation disguised as investment needs to end. We're offering these markets true partnership, sustainable growth, and ethical capital management. And the profit margins? Eleanor pulled up a series of projections, actually higher than traditional methods, once you factor in long-term stability and reduced regulatory risk. Ethics and profits aren't mutually exclusive, something the old guard never understood. By day's end, Goldman had signed on as a strategic partner in Phoenix's global initiative. Eleanor stood at her office window, watching the sunset paint. Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and purple. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Saw you on Bloomberg. Mom would have been so proud. The message hit her harder than any headline. Their mother had been a quiet force, teaching her daughters that true power came from integrity, not just ambition. Eleanor wondered what she would have thought of all this, not just the business success, but the way it had been achieved. A knock at her door interrupted her reflection. David entered, carrying a thick folder. The final numbers from the Asian market integration, he said. We're exceeding all projections. The Thompson family has reached out about expanding our partnership. And? Richard's secretary, ex-wife. Now, I guess. She's requesting a meeting. Says she has information about some of his other hidden accounts. Eleanor considered this. Sarah had made her bed, just as Eleanor once had. But unlike Eleanor, she hadn't learned the right lessons. Legal vet her information, Eleanor decided, but keep her at arm's length. We're not building this empire on revenge or betrayal. We're building it on something stronger. She turned back to the skyline, to the city that had witnessed her transformation. Somewhere out there, Richard was drowning his sorrows in an overpriced beach house, while she was here, creating something that would outlast both of them. "David," she called as he turned to leave, "schedule a board meeting for next week. It's time to announce Phase 3. The Global Ethical Investment Initiative?" Eleanor nodded. Richard thought small, protected his territory, guarded his secrets. "We're going to do something different. We're going to change the whole game." After David left, Eleanor opened her laptop to review the Phase 3 proposals. The world of high finance had operated by the same rules for too long. Rules written by men like Richard, designed to protect their power. But Eleanor had learned those rules only to break them, to prove that success didn't require sacrifice. Of principles, her empire wasn't built on sand like Richard's had been. It was built on a foundation of truth, competence, and genuine value creation. And it was still rising. The document arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried in a stack of Mitchell Industries integration files. Eleanor might have missed it entirely, if David hadn't flagged it with a yellow post-it note bearing a single word. Important. She was between calls with European investors when she finally opened the manila envelope. Inside was a decade-old internal memo, written in Richard's distinctive scrawl. As she read, her coffee grew cold, forgotten. "Get me verification," she told Jessica 30 minutes later, "and find out if anyone else has seen this." The memo detailed Richard's biggest secret, a systematic fraud that made all his other financial manipulations look like accounting errors. He had been running a complex scheme involving pension funds, offshore accounts, and falsified investment returns. The scope was staggering, and it was still ongoing. "It's real," David confirmed an hour later, his face grim. "I've cross-referenced everything. The pension fund manipulation alone. We're talking billions in misappropriated funds. If this gets out—" "When?" Eleanor corrected quietly. "When this gets out." She stood, moving to her window. The morning sun caught the glass towers of Manhattan, making them glitter like fool's gold. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Richard was probably still congratulating himself on negotiating a comfortable exit from the merger. "Who else knows?" she asked. "Just the three of us for now." "But Eleanor," David hesitated, "this isn't just about Richard. If this becomes public, it could destabilize the entire merger. Phoenix could be tainted, by association." Eleanor turned back to her desk, picking up the memo. "No, this is exactly why Phoenix exists. We're not here to perpetuate the old system's crimes. We're here to fix them." She pressed her intercom. "Jessica, get me Maria Herrera and the heads of legal and compliance. Emergency meeting in 20 minutes. As her team assembled, Eleanor studied each face. These were people who had bet their careers on her vision of ethical finance. Now she was about to test their commitment to that vision. "What I'm about to show you," she began, "will shake the foundation of everything we've built. But how we handle it will define everything we're going to build." The revelation hit like a bombshell. Maria gasped audibly at the numbers. The head of legal started making rapid notes. Compliance looked like they might be sick. "If we expose this," Maria said slowly, "the fallout will be nuclear, not just for Mitchell Industries, but for the entire sector." "The pension funds alone?" "The pensioners," Eleanor corrected. "Real people with real lives who trusted their futures to us. To me, because that's what this is now. My responsibility. We could handle it quietly," legal suggested. "Internal. Corrections, gradual adjustments." "No." Eleanor's voice was firm. "That's what Richard would do. What he did do, for years. We're going to do something different. We're going to tell the truth. The shareholders," compliance began, "will be protected by the plan we're going to develop. Right now. Because we're not just going to expose the fraud, we're going to fix it." For the next 6 hours, they worked without breaks, ordering in lunch, then dinner. Eleanor drove them hard, demanding solutions that would protect the innocent while ensuring accountability. For the guilty, by midnight they had a plan. It was ambitious, perhaps even impossible, but it was right. Eleanor looked at her exhausted team, feeling a surge of pride. This was what real business leadership looked like. Not covering up problems, but solving them. "Get some rest," she told them. "Tomorrow, we begin." After they left, Eleanor sat alone in her office, staring at the memo that had changed everything. She thought about Richard, about how he would react when he realized his final secret was about to be exposed. He would rage, threaten, maybe even try to destroy her. But he would fail, because Eleanor wasn't just a businesswoman now. She was a force for change. And change, real change, required courage. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Richard. "We need to talk tomorrow about the Peterson Pension Fund." His response came quickly. "Don't do this." Eleanor smiled grimly. "Too late," she typed back. The truth was always going to come out, Richard. The only question was who would tell it first. She turned off her phone and began to draft the press release that would shake Wall Street to its core. The headline was simple but devastating. Phoenix Capital uncovers historic fraud, announces comprehensive restitution plan. Tomorrow would bring chaos, but also clarity. And in that clarity, Eleanor would build something unprecedented, a financial institution that actually deserved people's trust. Richard was waiting in Eleanor's office when she arrived the next morning. She'd known he would be. It was what she would have done in his position. His expensive suit couldn't hide the desperation in his eyes. "You can't do this," he said without preamble. "I already have." Eleanor set her briefcase down calmly. "The SEC received our full disclosure package an hour ago. The press release goes out at 9. Richard's facade cracked. "You'll destroy everything, the company, the shareholders." "You destroyed it," Eleanor cut in. "Years ago, when you decided that other people's futures were yours to gamble with. I'm just bringing the truth to light." I'd watched him pace. This man who had once seemed so powerful to her. Now she saw him clearly. A cornered fraud, desperately trying to protect his house of cards. "I can make you rich," he offered. "Richer than you've ever dreamed. Just hold off." On the press release, Eleanor's laugh was genuine. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about money. This is about doing what's right." Her intercom buzzed. "Ms. Mitchell, the board members are assembling in the main conference room. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." She turned back to Richard. "You have a choice. You can come with me and face this with whatever dignity you have left, or you can run. But you can't stop what's coming." The board meeting was exactly the chaos she'd expected. 20 of Wall Street's most powerful figures, all realizing that their comfortable world was about to implode. "The restitution plan is comprehensive," Eleanor explained, her voice cutting through the panic. "Phoenix Capital will guarantee all pension fund obligations. We've secured additional backing from our international partners. No pensioner will lose a dime." "And the cost?" someone demanded. "Substantial." Eleanor met each gaze directly. "But manageable through asset liquidation and restructuring. More importantly, it's non-negotiable. This is happening." She laid out the plan in detail. The fraud exposure, the restitution process, the complete restructuring of both Mitchell Industries and Phoenix Capital into a new, transparent entity. "The short-term pain will be significant," she acknowledged. "Our stock will take a hit. Some of us will face legal scrutiny. But we'll emerge stronger, cleaner, and more profitable in the long run." Richard sat silent through her presentation, a broken emperor watching his empire crumble. When she finished, he stood shakily. "You were supposed to be the perfect corporate wife," he said. "What happened to you?" Eleanor smiled. "I woke up." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The press release went out exactly at 9. By 10, Mitchell Industries' stock had been halted due to volatility. By 11, the financial media was calling it the biggest scandal since Madoff. But Eleanor was ready. As the markets reeled, she implemented Phase 2 of her plan. Phoenix Capital announced immediate acquisition of key Mitchell Industries assets. Emergency credit lines were activated. Strategic partners stepped in with support, drawn by the promise of a new, ethical financial paradigm. The SEC is here, Jessica announced late in the afternoon. Show them to the conference room, Eleanor instructed, and get me the latest market analysis. The numbers were brutal, but exactly as projected. Mitchell Industries was in freefall, but Phoenix was holding steady, protected by Eleanor's careful preparation and transparent handling of the crisis. Richard appeared one final time as evening fell. He looked older, defeated. "They're going to arrest me," he said quietly. "Yes." Eleanor didn't soften the truth. "The evidence is overwhelming. The best thing you can do now is cooperate." He nodded slowly. "You planned this perfectly. The timing, the press, the asset acquisition. You're better at this than I ever was." "No," Eleanor corrected. "I'm just better at remembering that business isn't just about profits. It's about people." After he left with the federal agents, Eleanor gathered her core team. They looked exhausted but proud. "Phase 3 begins tomorrow," she announced. "The cleanup will be messy, but we're going to build something revolutionary from these ashes. A financial institution that serves people, not just profits." David raised his water glass. "To Phoenix Rising." Eleanor smiled, thinking of how far they'd come. From corporate wife to corporate revolutionary, from victim to victor. But this wasn't just her triumph. It was a victory for every person who believed that ethics and success could coexist. To truth, she corrected, raising her own glass, and to change. 3 weeks after Richard's arrest, Eleanor stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia Business School. The invitation to speak had come from the dean himself, her alma mater eager to claim connection to the woman who had reshaped Wall Street. "The headlines call it a scandal," she began, her voice carrying to the back row. "But what happened at Mitchell Industries wasn't just about one man's fraud. It was about a system that prioritized profit over people, that valued appearance over substance." The audience, a mix of students, faculty, and media, hung on every word. Eleanor had become more than a business figure. She was a symbol of transformation. "The real story isn't about the fall of Mitchell Industries," she continued. "It's about what we're building from its ashes." Back at Phoenix headquarters, the transformation was already underway. The pension fund restitution program had begun, with the first checks going out to retirees who had nearly lost everything. Each envelope contained not just money, but a personal letter from Eleanor explaining what had happened and how Phoenix was making it right. "Ms. Mitchell." Jessica appeared in her office doorway that evening. "The Justice Department called. They want to know if you'll testify at Richard's trial." Eleanor looked up from the stack of restitution letters she was personally signing. "Tell them yes. The truth needs to be heard. All of it." The truth had become her North Star, guiding every decision in the aftermath of the takeover. While other financial institutions scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, Phoenix had chosen radical transparency. Every document, every transaction, every decision was open to scrutiny. "The European markets closed strong," David reported during their evening briefing. "Our transparency initiative is attracting institutional investors who want to prove they're serious about ethical reform." "And the pension fund audits?" "Proceeding as planned. We've identified 3 other firms with similar irregularities. They're quietly approaching us about consultation services." Eleanor smiled. The ripples of change were spreading faster than she'd anticipated. Other financial institutions were realizing that the old way of doing business was no longer sustainable. Later that night, alone in her office, Eleanor received an unexpected call. Sarah, Richard's second ex-wife, sounded desperate. "They've frozen everything," she said. "The accounts, the properties. I didn't know about any of it, Eleanor. You have to believe me." "I do believe you," Eleanor replied softly, "because I was you once. Come see me tomorrow. We'll talk about your options." After hanging up, Eleanor walked to her window. The city. Lights sparkled below, each one representing lives touched by the financial industry's decisions. lives she now had the power to protect. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Saw your speech online. Mom would have loved seeing you teach those MBA students about ethics." Eleanor smiled, remembering their mother's simple wisdom about right and wrong. The complexity of high finance couldn't obscure those basic truths, something Richard had never understood. The next morning brought fresh challenges. The financial press was full of speculation about Phoenix's next moves. Competitors were trying to poach clients by spreading fears about stability. Former Mitchell Industries executives were giving anonymous interviews, trying to shift blame. But Eleanor remained focused on her vision. In her morning team meeting, she unveiled the next phase of Phoenix's transformation. "We're not just fixing the past," she explained to her executives. "We're redefining the future of finance. Every product, every service, every decision will be measured not just by its profitability, but by its impact on people's lives." The day ended with a small victory that meant more than any headline. A letter arrived from a retired teacher in Ohio, one of the pension fund victims. She wrote about her fear when the scandal broke, her relief when Phoenix stepped in, and her gratitude for Eleanor's personal letter explaining everything. "You didn't just save my pension," the teacher wrote. "You restored my faith that there are still people in finance who care about doing what's right." Eleanor pinned the letter to her office wall, a reminder of what really mattered in the aftermath of revolution. Not the headlines or the stock prices, but the lives touched and the trust restored. The old world of finance, Richard's world, was crumbling. And from its ruins, Eleanor was building something that would last. An empire founded not on secrets and lies, but on truth and responsibility. 6 months after Richard's arrest, Phoenix Capital's new headquarters buzzed with energy. The glass-walled building, selected for its symbolic transparency, housed what Forbes had dubbed the future of ethical finance. Eleanor walked through the trading floor, noting how different it felt from Mitchell Industries' testosterone-fueled environment. Here, diversity wasn't just a corporate buzzword. Teams were balanced not only by gender and ethnicity, but by background and perspective. Former Wall Street veterans worked alongside tech innovators and social impact specialists. Every decision went through both financial and ethical review. The new compliance system is fully operational, Maria reported during the morning executive meeting. "Every transaction is now traceable and transparent to all stakeholders." "And the resistance?" Eleanor asked, knowing change never came easily to the financial world. "Decreasing. Our profit margins are speaking louder than any criticism. Turns out, ethics can be profitable." The proof was in the numbers. Phoenix's ethical investment framework had attracted a new generation of clients: tech companies, sustainable energy firms, and social enterprises that traditional banks had overlooked. But more importantly, it had retained the traditional clients who had witnessed how Phoenix handled the pension fund crisis. "Ms. Mitchell?" Jessica appeared at the door. "The new training program participants are ready for your welcome address." Eleanor gathered her notes. The training program was her pride and joy, a comprehensive initiative to reshape how financial professionals thought about their role in society. Each cohort included both new graduates and experienced professionals, all learning to balance profit with purpose. "You're not just here to make money," she told the assembled group. "You're here to make a difference. Finance isn't just about numbers, it's about trust, responsibility, and the real lives affected by our decisions." Ow. Saw understanding dawn in their eyes. These weren't just platitudes. They were learning from someone who had exposed a massive fraud and then spent millions making it right. Later that afternoon, Eleanor met with her innovation team. The old Mitchell Industries office would have called them disruptors, troublemakers. Here, they were the future. "Show me what you've got," she encouraged. They presented a revolutionary banking platform that combined blockchain transparency with social impact metrics. Every investment would be tracked not just for financial returns, but for its effect on communities, environment, and social welfare. "It's ambitious," the team leader admitted. "It's exactly what we need," Eleanor countered. "Get it done." As evening approached, Eleanor reviewed the latest report from the pension fund restitution program. 98% of affected accounts had been restored, with the remaining cases involving complex international transfers. Each success story represented a promise kept, a trust restored. David appeared with the daily briefing. The market's responding well to our new initiatives. 3 more traditional banks have announced ethical banking programs. Copycats? Eleanor smiled. But that's good. Change happens faster when success breeds imitation. She turned to her window, watching the sunset paint the city skyline. Somewhere in a federal prison, Richard was awaiting trial. His world of financial shadows was fading, replaced by something stronger, clearer, more sustainable. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of her mentees, a young woman she'd met through the training program. Used the ethical decision framework. Today. Turned down a profitable but questionable deal. My old boss would have fired me. My new one congratulated me. Eleanor felt a surge of pride. This was how real change happened. One decision, one person, one principle at a time. The reconstruction wasn't just about buildings or systems or profits. It was about rebuilding trust, reshaping values, redefining what success meant in the world of finance. Jessica, she called, schedule a town hall for next week. It's time to share phase 4 with the entire company. Because this was just the beginning. The old world of finance had been built on exclusion, secrecy, and greed. Eleanor was building something different, a world where profit and principle worked together, where success was measured in lives improved as well as dollars earned. And this time, the foundation was unshakable. 1 year after the transformation of Wall Street began, Eleanor sat across from a young woman in Phoenix's mentorship lounge. Rebecca Chen, no relation to David, was a promising analyst who reminded Eleanor of herself 20 years ago, brilliant, ambitious, and unsure of her place in the financial world. I keep wondering if I'm tough enough for this industry, Rebecca admitted, clutching her coffee cup. Eleanor smiled, remembering her own doubts. The question isn't whether you're tough enough for the old way of doing things. The question is whether you're strong enough to do things differently. The mentorship program had become Phoenix's most replicated initiative. 12 other major financial institutions had launched similar programs, all focused on supporting diverse talent and ethical leadership. Tell me about the deal you're struggling with, Eleanor prompted. Rebecca outlined a complex investment opportunity, highly profitable but with potential community impact issues. As she spoke, Eleanor noticed her grasp of both the financial and ethical implications. What does your analysis tell you? The numbers are great, Rebecca said. But the social cost analysis shows significant displacement risk in the target community. I can't recommend it in good conscience. Then you've already made the right decision, Eleanor affirmed. And you're exactly tough enough for the new Wall Street. Later that afternoon, Eleanor addressed a gathering of business school deans. Phoenix had launched partnerships with 20 top universities, redesigning finance curricula to integrate ethical decision-making at every level. We're not just changing how we do business, she told them. We're changing how we teach business. The next generation of financial leaders needs to understand that profit and purpose aren't opposing forces. They're essential partners. Back in her office, Eleanor reviewed the latest impact reports. Phoenix's ethical investment framework had proven so successful that it was becoming an industry standard. The Securities and Exchange Commission was considering similar requirements for all financial institutions. Ms. Mitchell? Jessica appeared. There's a call you might want to take. It's Sarah. Eleanor accepted the call, curious. Richard's second ex-wife had rebuilt her life after the scandal, using her experience to advocate for financial literacy education. I'm launching a foundation, Sarah announced without preamble, teaching women about financial independence and ethical investing. I was hoping, would you consider being on the advisory board? Send me the proposal, Eleanor replied, recognizing another opportunity to expand the revolution. The day's final appointment was unexpected. Barbara Astor, her former friend who had chosen Richard's side during the divorce, waited nervously in the reception area. Eleanor, Barbara began, I was wrong about everything. I've been watching what you've built here, and it's extraordinary. Eleanor gestured for her to sit. The past is past, Barbara. What brings you here now? My daughter's graduating. Business school. She talks about you constantly, about Phoenix's ethical framework, about redefining success. She wants to apply for your training program. Eleanor thought about the symmetry of it all, how the next generation was choosing a different path, how old wounds could become new beginnings. Have her send in her application, Eleanor said. We're always looking for people who want to make a difference. That evening, as Eleanor prepared for a board meeting, David brought in an advance copy of the Wall Street Journal. The headline read, Phoenix Effect: How Eleanor Mitchell's Ethical Revolution is Reshaping Global Finance. Not bad for a corporate wife, David joked. Eleanor shook her head. This was never about proving anything to Richard or his world. This was about building something that matters. She gathered her materials for the board meeting, where she would present Phoenix's next major initiative, a global ethical finance institute that would standardize and promote responsible business practices worldwide. The legacy she was building wasn't just about money or power or revenge. It was about fundamental change in how business was done, in how success was measured, in how the financial world impacted real lives. As she walked into the boardroom, Eleanor thought about that morning's mentoring session with Rebecca. The young woman's ethical clarity, her commitment to doing what was right. That was the real legacy. Not just an empire built on principles, but a new generation ready to carry those principles forward. The revolution Eleanor had started would outlive her, and that was exactly what she had been building for all along. Eleanor stood in her old kitchen, the morning light streaming through the same windows where her story had begun 2 years ago. The granite countertop where Richard had left his goodbye note was now covered with files and laptops, the command center for Phoenix's latest initiative. The numbers from the Global Ethics Conference are incredible, Jessica reported, scrolling through data on her tablet. Over 5,000 financial institutions have signed on to the Phoenix Standards for Ethical Banking. Eleanor smiled, running her hand along the counter's smooth surface. She'd kept the penthouse not out of sentiment, but because it reminded her of how far she'd come. Every morning she made her own coffee now, not as an act of service to anyone else, but as a moment of quiet reflection before taking on the world. A notification popped up on her phone. Richard's sentencing was scheduled for next week. The trial had been surprisingly brief, his guilt too well documented to contest, but Eleanor felt no triumph in his fall. She'd moved beyond revenge to something far more powerful, genuine change. Ms. Mitchell, Jessica interrupted her thoughts. Your 9 o'clock is here. Angela Thompson stood in the doorway. Andrew Thompson's daughter, now head of her family's business empire. Like Eleanor, she represented a new generation of leadership. Hope you don't mind meeting here, Eleanor said, gesturing to the kitchen table. Sometimes it's good to remember where things started. It's perfect, Angela replied, setting down her portfolio. Especially given what I'm here to discuss. The proposal she laid out was ambitious. A complete restructuring of global investment banking, with Phoenix's ethical framework at its core. The Thompson family's influence, combined with Phoenix's moral authority, could reshape the entire industry. It's exactly what my father should have done years ago, Angela admitted. But he needed you to show us all a better way. As they worked through the details, Eleanor's phone buzzed with another message. Sarah's Financial Literacy Foundation had just received major funding. The woman who had once been Richard's escape route was now helping other women find their own paths to independence. By afternoon, Eleanor was back at Phoenix headquarters for a different kind of meeting. Rebecca Chen, now heading her own division, was presenting a revolutionary new financial product. We're calling it the Community Impact Bond, Rebecca explained. Every investment is directly tied to measurable social improvements. The better we make things for communities, the better the returns. Eleanor watched her former mentee with pride. Rebecca embodied everything the new Phoenix represented. Brilliant financial acumen combined with unwavering ethical commitment. Get it ready for launch, Eleanor approved. This is exactly what we've been building toward. Later, alone in her office, Eleanor reviewed the latest draft of her book. From glass ceiling to corner office, redefining power in finance wasn't just her story. It was a blueprint for change, a call to arms for anyone who believed business could be both profitable and principled. A knock at her door revealed David Chen. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing her a newspaper. The headline announced Richard's plan to plead guilty to all charges. "He finally learned about accountability," David commented. Eleanor set the paper aside. "He taught me everything he knew about business," she mused. "But I learned the most important lessons on my own. That true power comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. That success without ethics is just failure in disguise." The sun was setting when Eleanor finally headed home. In the elevator, she met a young intern clutching a stack of files. "Ms. Mitchell," the girl stammered, "I just wanted to say, you're the reason I went into finance. You showed us it doesn't have to be about greed." Eleanor smiled, remembering her own younger self. "What's your name?" "Maria Garcia." "Well, Maria Garcia, remember this. Every number in those files represents real people with real lives. Never forget that, and you'll never go wrong." Back in her penthouse, Eleanor walked to the window where she had once watched her old life crumble. Now she watched the lights of her new empire shine across Manhattan. Phoenix's headquarters gleamed. Brightest of all, a beacon of change in an industry that had desperately needed it. Her phone lit up with one final message for the day. The Global Ethics Conference had unanimously voted to adopt the Phoenix standards as their governing principles. The revolution she'd started would now become the norm. Eleanor poured herself a glass of wine, not to drown any sorrows, but to celebrate how far she'd come. From corporate wife to corporate revolutionary, from victim to victor, from student to teacher. The circle was complete, but the story wasn't over. It was just beginning for countless others who would follow the path she'd blazed. To new beginnings, she toasted her reflection in the window, and to all the glass ceilings yet to be shattered. The city lights twinkled back, promising tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that success and ethics could walk hand in hand. Eleanor Mitchell was ready for them all.